favorite apologists are here.
You know, you don't really see what a disaster your life is until you see it through the eyes of YouTube in your office. This is
just a bike in front
we
of
look
bookshelves.
like we look like college student wizards live here. That's basically what this looks like.
Yeah, the black is not helping with
Black
that.
is not helping. No, black is not.
Yeah, we're doing this, and after a number of people have asked about us doing a show, I think Hayden was the one who kind of initially brought that up. But yeah, we're gonna give it a try. So I guess I'll start off by introducing myself for those of you who don't know. My name is Jon DePue. I direct the Christian formation programs at a church in Cary, North Carolina. I've been doing that for about 3 years, actually a little over 3 years. I did my master's degree at Duke Divinity School, and prior to that did my BA in religion and philosophy from a little school in Iowa called Simpson College. Most of my work has been in Christian ministry, but I have still maintained an interest in the academy and the academic discussions, especially surrounding the New Testament and Paul in particular. So that's me.
Yeah, and I'm Laura Robinson. I'm John's wife. And I also am a PhD candidate at Duke University, and I will hopefully theoretically be graduating in the spring. That's what the goal is with the dissertation. I am primarily a historian by training. That's most of my work. Most of my work is in historical critical study of the New Testament. I also tend to be interested in theology, even though that's not where the majority of my training is. I actually do have a master's in theology. I just don't use it as much for what I do at Duke.
And forget about it sometimes.
And I often forget about it. Yeah, all the degrees start to blend together after a while. But yeah, most of my work is on the historical critical side of things, but I'm still very interested in theology, particularly in practical elements and modern concerns for theology in the church.
The question is, why are we even doing this? Like, why is this happening? Why have we been convinced?
Because we've been in quarantine too long.
I think that's the good initial answer.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's the real answer.
yeah. We've got nothing else to do. Help us.
Please
this is a cry for help.
Pay attention to us.
I honestly think the main reason that I wanted to start something like this, reluctantly so, because I'm really a sort of amateur when it comes to this sort of stuff, other than being on the other end of things on a channel, which is being interviewed. I've done several of those, but what I've wanted to see for some time is something on this kind of platform that's trying to think carefully about how academic discussions and theology and Bible are actually connected quite clearly with issues in Christian communities and in the lives of Christians. We often think of these in terms of like a contiguous relationship, right? But I think they're deeply intertwined, not least because the subject matter of biblical studies and theology is the same one as the church. We're dealing with the same texts, right?
Yeah.
Fundamentally. So there's already a connection there. And since I've started getting interested in the academic study when I came to do my master's, I've always had an eye toward the church stuff too. And now that I'm working in the church, I'm constantly having an eye back toward the academic stuff too. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, why I thought this might be a good idea to do, but I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, I wanted to do this because you told me you'd handle the post-production. So
you're like, yeah, it's fun.
I was like, yeah, I got a dissertation to write, so sure. I'll sit in front of a camera and tell people what I think. That sounds fun and easy. No, but the more serious answer, that was a serious answer. But the more serious answer is that, I normally work at a university. Kat is coming to visit us. I normally work, as a PhD student. Most of my work is research oriented at a R1 university. And also I spend a lot of time teaching at a divinity school or teaching undergrads. And I feel really strongly that the benefits and resources of a university education and university level discussion about history and theology and religious issues, religious literacy should not be a privileged thing that you have to buy with a university education. I really don't think academic conversations, academic discussion, academic interpretation of text, I don't think that's something that you should have to go to a university to get. Because, for one thing, as someone who works at a university, that's really depressing that the scope of our work will only ever be within the walls of our college. Or other similar colleges, but also from everyone else's end, that's not fair to the general public to make education resources and research available contingent on your ability to buy them. So I really, if you guys know my other show, New Testament Review, that has a podcast angle and a YouTube angle, we've been doing something really similar there. This is a lot more theology focused, more practical theology focused. New Testament Review is pretty much exclusively history and historical critical issues. This is, on the more lived religion side, on the more theology side. This is something that I've been trying to do for a few years in a few different capacities, with varying degrees of success, but this is another angle that I think would be a really great place to do it. So that's why I'm interested in this.
Let's get a little bit more kind of concrete about where we're both coming from individually into this kind of connection. So if you could just lay out really quickly what your primary interests are sort of academically, and then how you at least initially see those connecting to everyday Christian life.
My primary academic interest right now, my dissertation is on the Gospel of Matthew, to make a very specific topic more broad. Very interested in the relationship between Jews and Christians in the first century and how those categories might have overlapped in some communities, or it might have been more mutually informing in an era before Christianity and Judaism really become exclusive identities. I think part of why this is really relevant in the way we talk about today is talking about anti-Semitism and how to combat anti-Semitism within the church, and not to reinforce casual anti-Semitic tropes in our preaching and our Bible studies. A lot of times the way we talk about Pharisees in church can be really carelessly reinforcing anti-Semitic tropes. So that's just one of 1,000 practical issues I see between interacting between scholarship and practical issues in the church. Just historically speaking, let's go back and talk about the first century. What's a Pharisee? What is a Jew to the authors of the New Testament? What does this mean for them? So I think these are all really important things to talk about. I'm also just, as a Christian, I'm very interested in how people vote. I'm very interested in what rights people agitate for. When I'm not working on my dissertation, I volunteer with a Get Out the Vote initiative in North Carolina, trying to make voting more accessible to North Carolinians. So I tend to be interested in a range of social and political issues in North Carolina, and I'm very interested in how theology and research informs those.
Yeah, so where I'm coming from is kind of the other way around. I'm situated within a church context on a pastoral staff, so I'm preaching and engaged with the congregation, although it's very different right now because of COVID, but so it's
we don't leave the house.
It's mediated in a
ever.
way that I'm not going to have you, right? But even working in the church, I've always tried to think about how, let's say when I'm reading a text out of like Romans or something, I'm wanting to take seriously the scholarship that's going on when I'm prepping for something like a sermon or prepping to teach a class or something like that. I don't just go into this thinking, oh, well, that academic stuff is fine for the people in the ivory tower.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't really matter sort of practically for the church. And I think that's a mistake. Like Laura was saying about anti-Semitism and reading sort of religious leaders and Pharisees in the Gospels in this sort of harsh, really anti-Jewish way, that gets through into our pulpits when we're not actually listening to scholars and what scholars are saying. So it leads to bad preaching. It leads to misinformed congregants who will go on and reiterate this kind of poor reading and this kind of anti-Semitism. And then the way that they interact with the world socially and politically is going to be informed by that as well, right? That's kind of where I'm coming from. And my primary interest in the academic side of stuff is in Paul. So if you've seen me do interviews, I usually just say a bunch of weird stuff about Paul for like 2 hours. But I think that there's something to what I've been talking about in terms of the apocalyptic reading of Paul, which is really just centered on Jesus and his disclosure of God and the truth about God. And that the truth about God is that God is a God who enters into our human situation in order to liberate us from a huge problem of oppression and enslavement that's coming from evil and sin and death, and how that impacts our when we see things that are really holding us captive and oppressing us, especially oppressing certain groups of people quite harshly and unfairly.
Mm-hmm.
How that gospel of God's entrance into enslaved and oppressed situations speaks to how we as Christians should be responding to that in a way that's liberative, in a way that's sensitive to people who are in those very hopeless situations. And so that's the sort of connection that I'm really interested in making. I see this and have seen this quite clearly in our prison system in particular, where you have this really kind of harsh account of justice in terms of retribution. You do something wrong, therefore you deserve punishment for that. So that's at the heart of how our criminal justice system really works. I don't see that as lining up well at all with the account of the gospel that I see in Paul and in the scholarship that's on Paul that I think is really solid, is saying something very different about what Paul thinks God is like and what Paul is preaching, right? So that's just one kind of concrete example of why I care about that stuff. Bad scholarship leads to bad social
Yeah.
and political consequences. And I think prisons is where we see that very, very clearly in our American context.
John's actually assisting in a class on prisons in Paul right now. Not a historical look at first century prisons. I could have assisted in that class,
Yeah.
but the role in which constructions of the gospel feed into our discussion of the criminal justice system, and basically how can we think critically about the gospel and start dismantling the prison systems in the United States.
Laura, I don't know if you want to kind of summarize why we have that little Christianity you can live with in the title of our
Christian, this is actually a slogan I came up with, and this is something I actually I think about this a lot. That I think there's the slogan of the show is Christianity you can live with, and there's obviously two ways to read that. One is Christianity you can do something with, that you can live with practically in the world, that you can act on. But the other one I was thinking about is the one that that made me think of this is Christianity you can tolerate. And I think that a lot
you can stomach.
I'm 31 years old. I'm going to be 32 at Christmas, and I have spent a lot of my life in evangelical circles. I was raised in evangelical churches. I got my master's at an evangelical college. Been sort of in and out of that world for a long time, and I've seen a lot of people quit. I've seen a lot of people quit Christianity. I actually wrote an article about quitting Christianity in the Gospel of Matthew, but we'll talk about that another time. And I think a huge part of why I've seen a lot of people quit is because they were faced with a kind of Christianity in their churches that they in fact could not live with, that was intolerable, and that seemed to reinscribe a lot of patterns of, I say judgment not in sort of this like, Real Housewivesy, don't judgy kind of way, but just like a really condemnatory form of Christianity that doesn't seem to have a lot of room for reconciliation with people who are outside of the church, or reconciliation with people who have done wrong, or a robust place for women, or a robust place for people of color, or the LGBTQ community. I think a lot of times when we start hacking those people off or putting them in a diminished position in the church, and we're not using theology, we're not using the tools of theology and history to really think critically about how to protect and care for those people, we are producing a kind of Christianity we actually can't live with. And that a lot of people who might be more compassionate than their forefathers on these fronts truly cannot live with themselves. So I think this is something I think about a lot when I think about what it means to be a Christian for me, and what it means for the kind of Christianity I try to teach and represent in my classes. So this is a huge part of what I'm trying to do. So that's where the slogan comes from.
This concern that you're talking about, in some ways, hasn't really arisen out of the stuff, sort of Christian YouTube or anti-apologetic.
But
YouTube.
You see it a lot
so that's the
on
thing,
the
like,
right.
Because you're coming at this in that way, and I have similar concerns too.
Right.
We're very new to the YouTube stuff.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's kind of something missing in the way of a way of articulating Christianity that isn't caught up in these sorts of apologetic discussions, which is there is. I'll cut them some slack. I've been quite harsh on occasion. I have good apologist friends who run YouTube channels, and I appreciate them. But it's very sort of locked into this insular kind of discourse, right?
One kind of information that matters.
There are, of course, lots of different arguments, but it's all sort of within this very kind of almost specialized kind of discourse. It's the same thing for the anti-apologists, very specialized. There's not a lot of room for kind of Christians like me and Laura within those two, or even sort of between those two.
Oh, we just don't really care about that.
We're not that interested in that. And that's sort of another reason why this channel seemed like something to do, because maybe there are people out there who are listening to this who feel the same way and want to ask questions and to respond to
and would like free at-home content that doesn't fall into those categories. Yeah. Well, you can't.
We'll have super chat.
You can. You absolutely can't pay us.
Yeah, you can. I'll send you my Venmo information. So yeah, a part of this channel, as we envision it, is going to be also having guests on who are working on the intersection between sort of academic theology and biblical studies and our practical lives in the world. And we're going to have our first one at some point, hopefully in the near future, with a theologian who's very special to me in my own theological formation, who is working on a book having to do with depression and theology, and probably mental illness sort of more generally too. We'll keep you informed about when that's going to be happening as a live stream. But in the meantime, we also want to hear from you guys.
Yeah, please do. Please shout out to us, leave comments, and because we really are interested in, again, talking about trying to fill a space that we don't really think has been filled. Let us know what kinds of topics you want to hear about, that you things that you are curious about, things you would like to hear more about from a Christian perspective or from a more theologically literate perspective or informed perspective. If there's just stuff you haven't really heard discussed on a podcast before in relationship to faith, let us know and we'll talk about it.
And we're going to give y'all an opportunity to do that live. Not quite sure when. Maybe at the end of the week, maybe next week at some point. We haven't sort of nailed that down. But we'd like to do a kind of like test stream.
Yeah, just try it out.
Because neither of us have done that on our own before. So hopefully the curse of the New Testament Review podcast will not be carried over. Will not be transferred into Apocalypse here. So we'll let you know when that's going to happen, so you can have an opportunity to type in the chat questions you have. We'll answer some of them probably during at least sort of briefly, depending on how many people are there. And then if there are ones that we feel like would require more of a kind of more thorough kind of
then we'll set aside some time.
Then we'll set aside some time to make a video about it.
Well, you will set aside some time to make
I'll set aside some time.
I will parachute in
to make a video.
I will tell them what to think.
I'll open up the Zoom and Laura will just
I will just walk in and then I'll leave immediately afterwards. So
I don't have a sign-off thing. I don't know if we need one eventually, like a special sign-off.
We should probably think of one.
Something. We should have the chopper noise from Apocalypse Now at the beginning.
Oh, what about Ride of the Valkyries?
Flight of the Right? Is it Ride of the Valkyries?
Ride of the Valkyries.
Okay. That would be sick.
Yeah,
can we use that without having to pay anybody?
Well, it should be. It's Wagner. It should be open domain.
Good. Okay, so that may be an opening.
Ride of the Valkyries.
It could be opening too.
If anyone knows who has the copyright to Ride of the Valkyries,
let us know.
Tell us.
Or if you have any better ideas. That we'll either accept or reject. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. This was Apocalypse Here.
Apocalypse Here by Jon and Laura.
I don't know if I said that correctly at the beginning. I could have said Apocalypse Now because I have Apocalypse Now written down in my notes. So maybe I just called it something because it's my favorite movie.
Okay, sorry.
Anyway, we'll see y'all later, and we'll be in touch about when we'll be doing our live stream.
Sounds good.